Moving into chapter 10, we are talking about leadership and conflict management. I love talking about this stuff, so we might have a few more videos than normal here. So, starting with what makes a good leader and what leadership and power look like. So, there's this trait based leadership that sometimes we hear about, and that's where you'll hear things like, oh, they were born a natural leader, natural born leader, that kind of thing. Like they look at leadership as a personality trait. However, leadership is not a trait. It is, there are traits that make up a leadership skill, but it's not a personality trait. For example, personality trait might be like charisma, or a personality trait might be like open-minded or high need for cognition or empathetic or things like that. But leadership itself is not a trait. It's like a job. It's not a job, but it's like it's a it is a job. But I hope that makes sense. It's not a trait. You might have good leadership skills, but it's not because you were just born with it, right? It's a learned thing. So that doesn't mean that like nepotism, which means that like leadership roles are passed down in family structures. The best example here is like the royal family. So that's like a birthright kind of thing. Um, but that doesn't mean that they make good leaders because they were just born into it. So that doesn't mean that they don't make good leaders. It just means that there's more to leadership than just being born into it. So there are different types of power, and all of these are important, and I'll briefly go over all of these. First, we have legitimate power. This is like your title. So if you look at academic settings, you have graduate students, you have assistant professors, you have associate professors, you have full professors, you have chairs, you have deans, you have provost office leaders, you have the president, you have all of these different types of leadership. And with legitimate power, it has everything to do with the title. So the chair of the department is going to have more legitimate power than an assistant professor has in the department. A dean is going to have more legitimate power than the chair of a department, and so on and so forth. If you look at other organizational structures like businesses, or okay, if you've ever worked in a service industry, and I have worked in many service jobs such as food and retail, you have different levels of management, right? You might have like a key hourly manager who has legitimate power, but not as much legitimate power as the general manager, right? So the title is where legitimate power comes in. Coercive power is when someone exerts their power over someone with less power. So you might have something that you can use to get someone else to do something you want them to do. That's coercive power. People don't like, well, generally speaking, coercive power is not something that people like. People don't like to be coerced. They feel there's a sense of injustice involved there. Coercive power is not a great type of power to have. So reward power is kind of similar but different, where reward power refers to your ability to reward people for their behaviors, actions, achievements, etc. If I have the ability to give you a raise, that's reward power. If I have the ability to give you a free meal for your performance, reward power. Candy. I mean, I could be anything. Reward you with more time off. Um, but it doesn't mean that I am holding those rewards from you in order for you to do what I want. That would be coercion, coercive power. Then we have expert power. So you might have someone in not a legitimate power role, but has more expert power than someone who does have legitimate power in a higher status quote role. So expert power is just like, how much experience do you have doing this thing? How much can you give others based on your experience, right? So expert power has to do with experience and time invested in the organization, the skill, whatever it may be. Then referent power is honestly the best kind of power to have, because referent power is power that other people look up to. It's like the leader that people look up to. Um, Maybe even like feel this wishful identification with a leader. These are your visionary leaders, not necessarily your charismatic leaders, but can be. But visionary leaders have referent power. You can look at Martin Luther King Jr. as someone with referent power as a visionary leader, right? Then connection power just refers to your network. If you can provide other people with the connections that they need in order to succeed, that's connection power. Managers versus leaders. This is like tricky because managers are in a leadership role, but leaders don't, like, there are differences and similarities. So leaders don't necessarily have to be in a management role. I used the example earlier of like the department structure in an academic setting. You could have like the chair of the department who might have reward power or coercive power or legitimate power, but you might have an associate professor who has more referent power or connection power. Um, so it doesn't necessarily align in the way that we would think. You can also think about different groups that you've been in your schoolwork or your work or whatever, and you'll notice how some people, and maybe that person is you, they lean into their leadership skills and they become a leader through the group working process, which we'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to pause here because I feel like it's been a few minutes, and I'll pick up for the next slide.